Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me? My name is Martino Picardo, and I'm chairman of Discovery Park, and I would like to welcome you all to this session, a capstone panel discussion titled, What Can the UK do to achieve extra years of healthy life by 2035, as set out by the UK government? Before I welcome and introduce the panel, or at least allow them to introduce themselves, I'd like to make a few opening remarks. The whole conference thus far has attracted over 550 registrants, which is fantastic. And there are over 140 registered for this session today. There's been a wide range of participants, including the MRC, UKRI, Research England, Wellcome, a whole host of investors, including BioCity and others, and intriguingly, a number of elders from our focus groups. And we expect a wide variety today to join in with this discussion. We'd like this to be a catch-all of the discussions that have taken place to date. And we've been very kindly supplied with some of the key highlights of the conference to date, some of which we hope to discuss with you now. We want this to be an interactive session, so please provide your questions and/or discussion points through the chat box, and I will try to capture as many as possible as we go along. I know we are fortunate to have the panel that we have, and I'm grateful to them for giving of their time today. Please now let me go through the panelists and allow them to introduce themselves. And I see Joanne first on my screen, so Joanne, over to you. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So I'm Joanne Rhodes. I'm the Chief Executive of the Health Innovation Research Alliance, recently taken over this role, and that is a cluster organisation designed to better connect the academic, clinical and health and business community in Northern Ireland. So I've just moved across from southeast of England to Northern Ireland in Belfast, so busy exploring as much as I can, very much outdoors. But I'm pleased to join you today. Just to give you a tiny note on my background, I'm a pharmacologist by training, and I've worked across the bioscience ecosystem in pharma at Pfizer and Merck, or MSD in the UK, as well as the startup ecosystem in London. And my whole, whilst I started in drug discovery, I'm interested in the whole gamut, multi-modalities of therapeutic interventions for aging.
Thank you, Joanne. And Julie.
Hi there, I'm Julie Brady. I'm from sunny Scotland up here. I'm business development lead for the drug discovery unit based inside the University of Dundee. We are a small molecule drug discovery group that have been running for 14 years now. Originally started up back in 2006 to develop new drug compounds for the diseases of the developing world. Over the last 14 years now, we've invested around about 85 million in our programs, and we're up to a size now of about 115 staff, most of whom have come from the biopharma sector. So we've got that good mix of skills in between the professional drug discovery background, but placed inside that academic environment. And around about 7 or 8 years ago now, we started to use the skills and the expertise and the background of the staff that we've got to work on global indications such as oncology, CNS diseases, and we now have about 10 programs that are looking at the validation of the novel drug targets in that space. And this is where we've started to work with the spine partners over the last 3 or 4 years now in the pathways underlying aging.
Thank you, Julie. And Glenn.
Hi, Glenn Wells, Director of Strategy and Planning at MRC, a role I've had since only earlier on this year. Before that, I had the pleasure of working with Chaz and the team, Julie included, on this ageing initiative and spine in Oxford, amongst other things. It's kind of a relevant background for me. I'm a biochemist and molecular biologist, cell biologist by training, but most of my time in funding and policy and clinical academia. In the current role, just trying to explore how MRC as part of UKRI and MRC as a council attacks the major challenges that we face ahead of us, of course, ageing being one of those.
Thank you, Glenn. And last and certainly not least, Chaz.
Yeah, thank you, Martino, and thanks for chairing this panel. So I'm chair of translational medicine in Oxford. I'm also the PVC for innovation. I work very closely with Bev and Brian and Victoria, who've done all the hard work pulling this sort of conference together. I should say Glenn and Julie were instrumental in sort of coming up with the idea of creating this sort of national network, this spine project. So it's nice to see the progress that we've made. So my interests are trying to come up with new drug targets and ultimately new drugs for patients. So thank you.
Thank you, Chaz. So just a reminder to the audience that the goals of this discussion are really twofold: to draw some conclusions from the conference and to look at the future of aging research. And as we go through the questions, I'll be looking for interaction from you in the chat box. I'll be looking at some of the key points that have come out from the highlights. And if you don't feel that we're covering the key points in our questions, please feel free to tell us. So I'm now going to go straight into our first question, which I believe is going to be led by Julie. And the question goes, modeling diseases of aging has been a recurring theme during the conference, ranging from biomarkers to the use of animal models. So which models would you suggest the UK concentrates its investment in and why? So Julie, please give us your flavour from early stage drug discovery, and we'll ask Joanne to pick the story up from there.
Yeah, thanks, Martino. So in terms of early stage drug discovery, we're often looking at novel targets and novel target biology, but what we need to do in terms of at the early stages of investing in a program is to look at the pathway through to the clinic. And obviously a big part of that is looking at the models that we'd have to use to get there. I think what we're seeing in terms of talking to pharma companies and investors about the best way to translate these programs through is that there's a increasing interest in human data as opposed to animal models. And certainly in terms of work we're doing in terms of trying to raise investment for spin-outs, everybody's asking for the data in tissue samples. I think one of the interesting things that we can look at the moment is organoids, and I know that was discussed particularly in the session with Paul Potter. And I think the other interesting thing that he talked about was how to find models where we can look at the variability that we see in the patient population. I think that's a big challenge that is certainly going to need investment. But I think one of the things we do need to be careful of is it's very easy to find a way to stop a drug discovery program. There's always a risk factor in there that you've got to work around. So for me, the balance has always got to be to find the best models to take things forward. And that could be a combination and not just looking at single models in terms of taking things forward.
Thank you so much, Julie. Joanne, will you pick up the story from there, please?
Yeah, I think Julie's made some fantastic points there, and I think I'd like to approach it from a slightly different angle. So in early discovery, you're very much focused on the disease, the target, and the pathway. When I was working for MSD Centre for Diseases of Aging, we very much focused on a more multi-morbid approach, which was to look at the pathways that were common across multiple diseases. So inflammation and how it feeds through to neurodegeneration, cardiovascular disease, and even joint disease, and then develop some primary cellular assays, often which are complex and involve a huge amount of sort of husbandry, maybe up to 14, 15, 16 weeks of development in order to assess those pathways. And I think that that's one of the challenges. You can do very quick, high throughput models and then animal models following on from that to test your target, but you really need to understand how that interacts with the different pathways. And I think if we take a holistic approach and develop models that are of common pathways, then the drug discovery teams can then pick up the individual targets that occur within those. But we do need that route through to multimorbidity, because I think that's become increasingly more important. The other piece, I think, again, to pick up Julie's point about health data, is that real world evidence challenge. And I think that we need to understand the translation and how that feeds through from the targets and pathways into the clinic. And so better support, I think, for really understanding and developing models that link the clinical data back to the animal model data, back to the cellular data, and understand that translation, I think is needed. It's very difficult to rely, I think, on the clinicians to do that when they're busy, treating patients at the same time. So more investment, I think, there is very much needed.
Thanks, John. And I note from the highlights that point was made by NC3Rs around the need for more investment, that no animal model is perfect. Chaz, how do we bring this all together? Joanne's point about clinicians not having the time and research not being linked in appropriately. How do you bring this all together through the best models that we possibly can?
Yeah, thanks, Martino. I mean, I have to say I have a pretty extreme view on this. I do not believe that we have, I'm not a fan of animal models. I don't think we have a good animal model of single diseases. We don't have a good animal model of Alzheimer's. We don't have a good animal model of osteoarthritis. We don't have a good animal model of depression. And many of my colleagues working in the cancer space, they say they don't have a good animal model of cancer. I think the chances of us having an animal model of multimorbidity and aging is practically zero. And what I'm much more focused on, and I think Julie and Joanne touched on it, I would much rather it's got to be human all the way. Let's try and extract whatever we can from human genetics. Let's identify ligands for human proteins. I don't care about ligands for rat receptors or mouse receptors. We can now access human primary cells in inflammatory cells, cancer cells. We can now derive neurons from iPS cells, etc. Let's test our molecules in those human cells. We can now, using new platforms, have much better sort of biomarkers, etc. Sort of Somologics have got this platform where they can measure 5,000 proteins in a tiny sample of blood. I think, and soon they'll do 10,000, and soon they'll do 20,000, etc. So let's use these biomarkers that we can now detect in patients, and then get into experimental medicine studies as quickly as possible. So, I favor just the human path all the way through as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Chaz. I guess that's something for the UK Spine to really pick up on and probe in a bit more detail. But Glenn, is it human all the way, or is there still a role for animal models? Do you think more that can be done? Do you have a counterpoint, or do you agree with Chaz?
I guess I wouldn't go as far as saying we can do what Chaz wants us to do now, but I don't disagree that's the direction of travel. I would probably argue that an appropriate model of aspects of diseases of aging, or the aging process itself, is a window. It's somewhere to start, but it's not going to give us the full clinical picture. And so that's where I would start to agree with the general tone of all the panelists so far, is actually pushing the human line, looking at experimental medicine, discovery research through experimental medicine, and through that translation into that space is something which we're very interested in. As a council and as UKRI, although just to be clear, we're not pulling away from investing in generation of models where it's appropriate to do so. But we'd also agree, so from a personal perspective, that actually it's about experimental medicine and trying to gain the knowledge in the animal you're trying to treat at the end of the day. And although that is not trivial to do, and we can't do it alone as a council, we have to do it in partnership with other funding councils in UKRI and their communities, because this is a complex problem, particularly when you get to biomarkers, how you detect them, how you interpret them, how that all scales up in drug discovery initiatives. So complex to research and complex to fund. But I would argue, yes, we should be pushing towards that. Can we do this in the human model more than the animal model?
Thank you. And I was particularly impressed, and I think Julie and Joanne picked up on the Paul Potter slide that clearly outlined what was needed in those healthy aging studies that could easily be transferred from animal to human. I do have a couple of questions that have already come in, so thank you. This one is from Nick Wilcox. In autoimmune myasthenia gravis, the incidence of the subgroup with onset after age over 45 has increased worldwide fivefold since 1990. So even after adjusting for population age, where should we look for causes? Back in the 1960s or more recently? Any suggestions? That's an interesting one. I can't see all of you, but I'm going to go back to the beginning and just see, Julie, just a yes or no. Do you have any comments on that one?
No.
Joanne, come on, this is right up your street.
I don't. It's such a specific question. I don't know.
And Chaz?
I'm afraid it's no, Martino. Sorry.
Okay. And Glenn, I'm assuming it's the same from you, yeah?
On the specific issue, I couldn't answer that one, but I think the general thrust of that around being able to detect early on the life course to understand the progression of diseases is essential. And I think that's a shared goal between all aspects of our community and across research sectors. So the specific example, no, but on the general thrust of trying to find out causes earlier in life course and prevent, yes, I think it's about picking up early.
Thanks, Glenn. I think you saved us, but it was a very, very specific one, and it was unfair of me to throw it at you. I apologise. Here's one that I think we can do a little bit. It comes from Graham Wilkinson at the Catapult. Given what the panel have said about human-based models, is there a place for the use of techniques like CRISPR to generate more humanized models? That's a good question. So I'm going to throw this at Joanne.
Thanks, Martino. Absolutely, yes, I think. It's a very interesting study I was involved in when I was working in the Rare Diseases Consortium with Pfizer, and we were studying Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and we had a cell model there of cells taken from Duchenne's patients. And we actually, in order to get a control, we didn't want to use a healthy patient. We actually used CRISPR, or we didn't, sorry, the Blizzard Institute at Queen Mary's, University of London, used CRISPR to transform patient cells back into healthy cells, as it were, or just rather than a healthy cell, just correct the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy gene, and then we could look at how those cells functioned just with the gene correction, which meant if you were looking at gene therapies and actually just correcting genes there, I think it was really interesting, because just by correcting the gene, you didn't take it back up to where a healthy patient was. So I think there's a really important role for CRISPR there, where you can, back correct, get rid of the target that you're trying to inhibit or reintroduce it, and then understand what the underlying patient landscape is in those cell models, rather than just assuming that a healthy is a good model of that, if that makes sense. So absolutely, yes, I think CRISPR opens up the door to some really interesting and precise models in that area.
Thanks, Joanne. And the questions are coming in thick and fast, and I want to make sure we move on to at least question 2. So I just want to ask Julie, is CRISPR on your radar?
Yes, it is. Yes. And one of the things that we do as well is obviously recognising that we can't take on board every new biology and every new technology. We do that by partnering with the experts in the field. So again, that's one of the advantages of having a professional drug discovery group sitting inside the academic environment. So you get first-hand access to all this new technology coming through.
Brilliant, Julie. Thank you for that. I'm going to move us on. Danielle, I'm going to apologise for your question around data science, because I think we're going to come on to that. And I think I'm going to move on to the next question. Bear with me. So question 2, which I believe is going to be led by Chaz. What's the most important issue the government should tackle to choose the health inequality? to close the health inequalities across socioeconomic groups in order to achieve its stated gain of 5 extra healthy years of life by 2035. Chaz, over to you.
Martina, that's a tough question, I think, certainly for me, probably for all of us. I mean, I think, you know, it's a great goal, and I'm glad the UK government has set that goal. But of course, the way to tackle it is multi-pronged, you know, sort of, we need to tackle social care, we need to think of the environment, we need to think of sort of economic challenges. I think what people like us are much more focused on is, can we use our biology know-how and actually improve the lives of elderly patients and give them an extra 5 years of a healthy life by delivering better, safer medicines? And that's what we're largely focused on. And I think in the next 15 years, we can do that. I think the way Bev and the team have set this project up, you know, we're working together, we're pooling our resources, we're pooling our technology, we're pooling our expertise to tackle this one problem, multimorbidity associated with aging. I think we have a real chance of doing it. And I think the work that Bev is doing with people like James Edwards and Graham Russell, etc., around bisphosphonates, I think that is potentially a repurposing opportunity. I am so optimistic about the clinical data with bisphosphonates in tens of thousands of patients. And bear in mind, these drugs have been around for 4 or 5 decades and been into, I don't know how many 100 million patients, etc. But I think there's an opportunity to repurpose something that could give us a generic drug to treat multimorbidity, which will be very, very cheap. I think that would be fantastic. And I am confident, working with Julie and the team in Dundee and our colleagues in the Medicines Discovery Catapult and in Birmingham and the CRIC and this broader national network that the Spine set up, I'm confident in the next 15 years we will come up with 2 novel targets and hopefully 2 novel drugs to treat multimorbidity. So that's a personal ambition, and I hope together we can deliver it.
Well, don't forget this is being recorded, Chaz, so we'll hold you to that. That's really exciting. I think, Glenn, it's over to you to move the conversation forward. Some of your views on government.
Yeah, so to start with a really obvious statement, which is there's a lot to try and understand if you're going to look at how you extend a healthy lifespan or health span and gain extra years at least in a high state of well-being. What we can do as a funder is we can obviously look at things that are very biologically focused, clinically and medically focused around multimorbidities or discrete diseases of aging. But we very quickly have to begin to understand all the social, economic, cultural aspects of how we age as a society. So robust, resilient societies, you would like to think you can then promote well-being through those things and if you like, prevent progression into some of these diseases associated with aging. It does not negate the need for us to understand how those factors affect the system, the biological system that we are, that we have, that we exist through. And if we can do that, we can understand what kicks off disease, how later years are affected in early life, much about on the earlier questions, and then we begin to detect, we begin to diagnose, prevent progression and or prevent entirely. There is no simple answer to the question. It's so multifactorial and involves so many different research communities that it's a very challenging thing. But what we should do and what we will do as a funder is continue to fund broadly in these areas across all technologies, across all stages of research to try and understand the problem to improve our well-being and live for longer, healthy years.
Thank you, Glenn. So Julie, Joanne, just to prime you, I just want to share with you some of the highlights from one of the sessions around that was titled Enabling Public Engagement with Research. And this was with the elders. And the focus group reported that when they asked the elders on their priorities for healthy aging, therapeutics was lowest on their list. Communication, the elders did not feel that the messaging we use is accessible to them. Words like geroscience and therapeutics were unfamiliar to them. We don't have the right buy-in or trust from the older community. They feel isolated, unseen, and unheard by society. Wow, that's quite a damning indictment on us as a community. Julie, what can we do about communication?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really interesting point, because one of the things I'd been thinking before seeing that was that there's obviously a big concern about compliance. We all know how to be healthy. We all know that we shouldn't smoke, we shouldn't drink alcohol, we should do lots of exercise and get fresh air and take our medications and all these things. But most of us don't. And why is that? And is there a lack of the right messaging? And if so, how do we fix it? And in terms of public engagement, certainly it's one of the things that we do as part of our Wellcome Centre for Anti-Infectives research, is we've invested significantly in public engagement, but thinking at it now, it's really all focused at a different generation. We're really focusing that on trying to encourage the younger generation to be more involved in science, to take science in university, as opposed to engaging with the older generation. So it's a note that I need to take back, is that we need to find a way to do this and do it an awful lot better, because we're clearly not getting the right messages through.
And Julie, hold that thought, because it's a great thought when we come on and talk about skills and how we train the next generation to be better as well. Joanne, one of my peers, Nancy Rothwell, very early on in my science research days, used to say, you need to get better at communicating to the layperson, Martino. Stop using 3-4 letter acronyms. They won't understand you, and they won't understand the value and the benefit. What do you think, Joanne?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's so important that the messaging will fit the audience. And if you take a step back from health in general, groups that are very good at this are the consumer focused businesses. So if you think about consumer health, you think about Fitbits and how they message. Even Bupa are trying to attract consumers, and they message very differently. And I think there's quite a lot that we can learn from the science community as to how we message. And again, going back to multidisciplinarity, actually, yes, we need to involve the patients. We need to involve the economists and the regulators in this, but actually involving people that understand how to translate the message and motivate different consumers, I think is really important, and to actually bridge that gap as well, because as scientists, we're not particularly good at that. We're good at talking about science and understanding different analytical methods and picking apart data, but we may not be the best at communicating. So it's to involve the whole gamut of people who can understand the user experience and how to communicate to those people.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joanne, and thank you to all of you. We've got a very interactive delegate panel here as well, and I can see a great question from Deborah for you, Chaz. We have seen how we've been able to accelerate the development of the COVID vaccine. Is it possible to see an accelerated program around bisphosphonates, for example? Chaz?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something I know Bev and Graham and James and colleagues in Sheffield and Manchester at the MDC are thinking about. And because I mean, a big lesson for me from that COVID vaccine, certainly from the Oxford experience, has been, if I think through the narrative there, a couple of academics, Adrian Hill, Sarah Gilbert, set up this company, Vaccitech, 2-3 years ago. At the start of the year, senior colleagues in the university, so our Regis Professor John Bell, the Vice Chancellor Louise Richardson, the head of the medical school, got together. They pulled in government, they pulled in regulators, they pulled in funders, they pulled in AstraZeneca, and they came up with this single vision. We need to get a vaccine as quickly as possible. We're not trying to make money out of it. We need to save millions of lives, etc. And it is absolutely amazing what that group has done in the past 6, 7, 8 months. What normally would have taken 6, 7, 8 years. And so for me, a big lesson is if we can get all the stakeholders together and create that single goal, that single vision, together we can do the impossible. And so, yeah, Deborah, I mean, we need to think about this, and maybe we need to pull you into this discussion with Bev and Graham et al. So you can give us your advice.
Yeah,
Great.
I know Deborah, and she'll be keen to engage on that one. So I look forward to the outputs of that one. And we've got one from Sandra as one of the elders. I agree with Julie. It isn't that older people don't mind researchers. It's more that society as a whole tends to exclude the older generation. Communication is the key. Thank you, Sandra. That's really helpful. Glenn, one for you. How can we convince major funders that repurposing is not a dirty word and to significantly support our emerging clinical evidence of established off-patent targets? Like bisphosphonates, of course. That's a great example. Glenn, do you want to have a shot at that one?
I knew you were going to throw that one to me. I guess I'd say, from a personal perspective, I don't see repurposing as a dirty word. I guess the thrust of that comment is there's a sense of it not opening up new areas of research and being as exciting as other uses. But I think what I will say is I think we're moving to a space where we need to look at multi-modes of data and evidence and from different sources and be more open to trying to use those to understand the problems we're trying to address. I think convincing major funders is a case of putting in an application that is competitive. It gets as simple as that. But I think the wider conversation would be what can we use, what do we know, what we already have to hand tell us about a disease state and how it can be treated. And that's a conversation we're always open to have.
Thank you. So I think we're going to move on to question 3, and Joanne and Chaz are going to lead the conversation here. So the question goes, in our keynote lecture chaired by Professor Janet Lord, we addressed response and senescence to improve outcomes in older adults with COVID. So can the panel comment on how the UK strategy for improving healthy aging should address post-pandemic preparedness and the role of these types of trials in that strategy? And the answer should really focus on the impact of scientific collaboration and the impact that digital solutions are having. So, Joanne, over to you.
Thanks, Martino. I will come on to the digital solutions in a moment, but I wanted to draw everyone's attention to some of the key message from Janet Lord's session, which are, it mentions some companies like Restore Bio and some US trials that are looking at drugs in patients that may be able to restore immune resilience, so Restore Bio and others. What I'd like to see an investment in is to understand not just if drugs can boost immune resilience, but if other interventions can boost immune resilience. And I'm really sort of talking about some of what had been considered the softer sides of science, a decade ago, which was nutrition, exercise, and mental health. And I've heard a report. I was speaking to a company that was trying to set up a new dementia home where patients can freely roam, but safely, so they can spend more time outside, and that's been set up in Dover. It's very early on, was opened earlier this year and has been affected by COVID, but what they found is the patients tend to want to spend more time outside doing things like gardening and spending time interacting with others on that. And I think that that's a really important point, is that in a traditional care home, I believe that the statistic is the average is 90 seconds a week is what an elderly patient spends outside, which is, if we think about the impact on vitamin D, which, as we know, impacts multiple chronic diseases of aging, I think that's really important. So, I'd really like to, what that care home in Dover shows is the empowerment of the patients, to give that back to empower them to do what they need to do for their mental and physical health. And so I think for me, that's the key message of empowerment. Now, if we move on to some of the digital solutions for that, that is to enable those patients to interact. So you've got, the digital solutions that can allow people to remain at home, for instance, but monitor falls, monitor their engagement with their home, so whether they boil the kettle in the morning and all of those sorts of things. And I think these smart connected homes, smart connected neighbourhoods are going to allow people to remain within their homes and within their communities where that support system is, and then empower them to do what they need to do to have a healthier, more enriched life.
Thank you, Joanne. Chaz, can you pick up the conversation from there, please?
I mean, I have to say, Martino, I'm immensely excited at the moment because of some of the platforms and technologies that we have at our disposal. I mean, I touched on sort of fluid biomarkers with SomaLogics earlier on. They can measure 5,000 proteins in a tiny sample of blood. But, we can now, on the West Coast, they can do a whole body image, in 20 minutes for $600. With the wearable devices that Joanne talked about, we can now measure things in individuals longitudinally, non-invasively, cheaply, and 24/7. We're in the era now that we can measure thousands of data points in patients relatively quickly and cheaply. And now also with AI and machine learning, we can take these large data sets and come up with potentially new biomarker signatures and new ways of stratifying patients. So I'm immensely excited. On the AI front, I should also say I'm optimistic about the impact it's going to have in drug discovery. I think it's going to help us come up with better targets. It's going to help us generate clinical molecules more quickly. I think it's going to help us come up with biomarkers and ways to stratify patients. I think it's going to help us come up with sort of new combination strategies and potentially repurposing opportunities. So I think it's very, very exciting. I would also say, and I think Glenn or somebody touched on it earlier, if we can get better biomarkers or better diagnostics and we can pick up diseases earlier, then I think we're much more likely to be able to treat them and potentially prevent them. And if we can do that, it'll save the NHS an absolute fortune. So I think we've got to go for earlier diagnosis and prevention. My worry is most diseases we're trying to treat too late. Alzheimer's we're treating when, there's big populations of neurons missing. Cancer we're treating when it's already sort of spread across the whole body, etc. If we can catch it earlier, we'll be able to treat it and prevent it.
Glenn, thank you, Chaz. Glenn, can you pick up the role that partnerships and collaborations should be playing or are playing in this space?
Sure. I'd start with, obviously there's a question around COVID and we have to try and learn some things from COVID and the way that we've responded. And I think going back to the vaccine point, the collaboration across industry, academia, clinical settings that have delivered solutions, whether in the form of therapeutics or potential vaccines, in a matter of months, because of that tight collaboration, because of that willingness to work together for a single goal. And that's incredibly impressive, both in the UK and globally. So we see a model there, a very healthy model we shouldn't lose. This close collaboration, this shared goal, this vision of trying to address a health problem together rather than potentially in a more linear fashion. We usually do translation where industry comes in later, but they're here at the outset right now. So I think to answer the question directly, that's for me is very exciting. I know that we've had strong collaborations for decades in the UK, but these have come together and shown their value in a pandemic situation. We've also seen there's a change in the behaviour of collaborations where we're willing to share facilities. There seems to be a shift in the community saying, do we need national resources for these bits? And we'll all work with those rather than try and work in our own silos. So it's interesting as a funder to understand that dynamic change and how do we respond to that. And of course, some of that's driven by digital and being able to in fact interact virtually and exchange data very freely and rapidly, whereas we might have had barriers before. I would say as well, I'd also agree with Joanne on the point about how we need to look at the use of digital in society. There are many aspects of that. One, evaluate what can we do. then try and understand the data it produces and use that data to inform the research that we seek to undertake and fund. So, and that collaboration will be is a change again, because we'll involve much more communities to answer or address health problems and challenges than perhaps we would have done before. So I think we will see a huge change in how we collaborate, both as a consequence of COVID, learnings from COVID, and building on previous collaborations.
Thank you, Glenn. And I picked up on Joanne's point about the softer side as well. And I think I feel a project coming that Joanne can lead us on around those softer elements. Julie, just loop us back one last time around the communication challenge with all of this. You know, has made a very strong case of the importance of AI, but it's really important that we don't oversell, because our technologies are never a panacea. What are your thoughts on that?
Certainly, I agree with what all of the panelists have been saying about how impressive the sectors have come together to work together in response to COVID. We've seen this over a number of years now because we work in not-for-profit indications, and generally people are much happier to be inclusive and sharing when there's not going to be a profit made by any of the parties. So I think there's definitely learnings in there, and what we're doing as part of the UK Spine in terms of looking at the best ways to tackle aging is to have all the parties working in a partnership, currently just across the academic sector at the moment, but we're starting to see industry to get more engaged. And in terms of the question about, you know, boosting the immune response and the, I guess, communication of that out into the patient population, is that we can look at ways to boost people's responsiveness to disease, but compliance is still the problem, because we all know that you can boost your immune system with exercise and a healthy diet, but we don't do it. And I think if you go back to what Joanne was saying about in care homes, people are getting such little fresh air and exercise. That would be far better for them than taking one more drug to help boost their immune system.
Thank you, Julie. So, particularly Chaz and Glenn, you know, before we close this session, a question's come back in from Graham Wilkinson around repurposing again. I just wanted to address now, before we come on to a skills question led by Julie. A possible problem with drug repurposing or repositioning is who will sponsor the large-scale clinical trials, typically driven by pharma, when there is limited or no commercial benefit to be derived from the composition of matter. Is there a role for government? Glenn, let's start with you. Is there a role for government in that repositioning?
I think I'd have to give you all I can give you is a research funder perspective. There are aspects of that question which look at areas of procurement and policy issues that aren't in the research world. We provide the evidence for those, but we can't dictate how they're run. I think, you know, government public sector funders are very active in this space, and we continue to support repurposing clinical trials. But if you're driving at intellectual property issues and other factors around there, they're definitely beyond my ken, as they say.
Charles, any additional comments from you?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say this at the end, Martino, but, you know, I've been reflecting a lot in the past few months about what we've learned in this pandemic, and one of them was the power of collaboration, the Oxford AstraZeneca stuff, etc. But the other one was, I think we need to start thinking differently. We always tend to think of return on investment, but, you know, if you look back at this pandemic, you know, we knew this pandemic was coming. People predicted it, Gates predicted it, Fauci predicted it. Since the start of this century, there's been lots of outbreaks, you know, SARS, MERS, Zika, etc., etc. There's been 8 or 9 of them. So we knew it was coming. And since February, March, governments across the world have spent trillions of dollars, either protecting the vulnerable or supporting jobs or supporting companies or supporting industries. Going forward, governments are going to pay for, you know, 8 billion people potentially getting vaccinated. They're going to have to deal with the consequences of long COVID, educational gaps for a generation, mental health, etc., etc. You know, trillions of dollars, and you know, many countries are in recession or are going to go into recession. So I think we need to start thinking about, if we don't do something, there's a certain cost of failure. You know, if we don't come up, for example, with a new generation of antibiotics, it is going to cost governments across the world in the future trillions of dollars. Now, we know that to create a new medicine is $3 or $4 billion. So it's easy for me to say, well, why don't we put 10 billion in and say, Glenn, here's 10 billion, go off and you've got 10 years to come up with a new generation of antibiotics. And I'm sure Glenn could do it. I'm sure we could do it. So why don't we do it? And you know, it's a tough answer, isn't it? Sort of, because everybody goes to funders and says, you know, my area is more important. You know, Alzheimer's is important, mental health is important, infectious diseases is, diabetes, and they can't afford everything. And that's the problem. And so I think somehow we need to come up with creative solutions involving industry if we can, governments if we can, philanthropy if we can, charity if we can.
Thank you, Chaz. Thank you so much for that. That was a really powerful statement to leave us with on that question. And thank you for all the questions. And particularly thank you to Joanne for reviewing some of the key messages from the session from bench to care home in a time of COVID, because that really helped to focus the mind in the way that we addressed the question. So Julie, alert, alert, we're coming on to our favorite topic now. You're going to lead us, and we're now going to talk about the future of drug discovery and research. And there are 3 questions that are captured together here. The first is around, what are the most important skills to be developed for the future of drug discovery for healthy aging? The second is, with the business model for outsourcing primary biological work in the pharma industry overseas, do we run a risk of losing future scientists that will support the UK skills base? And what is our view on creating the best environment for cross-collaboration? There it is again, partnership and collaboration. Is it preferable to have individuals with multiple skill sets or specialist individuals contributing to multidisciplinary teams? Julie, I'm really looking forward to this. Please start this off.
Yeah, I feel quite passionate about this, as you know, which is why everybody in the panel is smiling, because I went off on one when we were having our preparation section.
Please go off on one.
I mean, when the DDU was established 14 years ago by 2 investigators who were working on African sleeping sickness, there was so much skepticism. I mean, the whole scientific and industry base thought they were completely mad trying to do drug discovery inside the university base. But if you look at the success over the last 14 years, it equals that of the biotech industry. We've got 3 drugs in clinical development and a pipeline coming through behind it. So it can be done. And I think without people thinking about the translation of research, it's not going to happen. Quite concerningly, I had a conversation about a week and a half ago with a UK CEO who stated quite clearly, we shouldn't be doing drug discovery in the UK. We just shouldn't be doing it. And I was so astonished by that, because if we don't think about the translation, it's not going to happen. For me, I think there's already a big gap in the UK across the strength of the academic base that we have, and how much of that makes it way through to the patient base. And you see a lot of the funders now are starting to look at that. The British Heart Foundation did a study a couple of years ago now, taking a review of all that they had invested in research with the academic base and what translated through to the patients. And it's alarmingly little. And I think all of the funders are now starting to think that way. The MRC are one of the few organisations that looks to bridge that gap. I'd like to see more of them doing it. So for me, it's a huge thing that we need to look at. We need to make sure that we have the skills that can do drug discovery in the UK, working much more closely with the academic base.
Thank you, Julie. That was great. Glenn.
I think I'll pick up on the Yeah, the business model and the skill sets, and how do you do cross collaborations? I think, yes, we do as a council look at this aspect, but actually it's only about 10 or 11% of our portfolio that we spend in this space in anger, so to speak. And there are live discussions about whether or not someone like us should actually put more in than that in both percentage terms and absolute terms. And the interesting thing is the more you kind of skew your portfolio, the more you risk losing developing skill sets that you probably need earlier on the drug discovery process. So it's actually quite a tricky balance for us to keep. And also the breadth of skill sets that you require are from more than just the bioscience, medical science, basic science community, and biological science community. And the key thing for us is trying to balance off a very broad and deep portfolio in underpinning and discovery science with the necessary to develop scientists to support that. And also there's a question in there whether or not you do discovery science so if you reframe that slightly, say discovery science can be done in translational settings, and by that I mean experimental medicine and moving things more clinically. So there's a little bit of a conversation to be had about reframing some of this whilst keeping, if you like, the purity of the mission of research councils like ours or charities or other funders. Best environment across collaboration. I'm kind of in the camp, if I'm honest, where having many multi-skilled people doesn't actually get you what you want. There are various parts of the drug discovery pipeline that absolutely require expertise and a limited set of functions, and we would lose that at our peril. But to Joanne's earlier point, I mean, clinical academic setting, medics are very busy treating people, and sometimes you can't expect them to be data scientists, clinical trial design, and understand the breadth of the underpinning biology. So we have to accept it's multi-skilled teams, I believe, from my personal perspective, as opposed to trying to upskill everybody to be a Swiss Army knife researcher, if you like, for drug discovery. It's not feasible. And that actually comes down to funders as well. We have to create a permissive, open and transparent environment to fund, in which we accept that you will build teams of that nature to do this kind of work, whether that's understanding the underpinnings of disease or whether it's translating. I think the same applies across the patch in that respect.
Thank you, Glenn. So, Joanne, pick up the story where you feel.
Yeah. I think you, both Julie and Glenn, raised some fantastic points that I'm hoping to pick up on, and I'm going to wave the flag for, I guess, the second half of my career that I've spent the last 10 years building, which is the first half was learning some deep science in the pharmaceutical industry, but the second half has been in that industry, academic, and policy space and clinical space, really trying to support strategic alliances. And I think it's underfunded. There's always more work to do, and I can draw on multiple projects where I haven't been in the lab doing any of the science, and I have spent most of my time supporting multidisciplinary teams. And that can be, as small as organizing a meeting, thinking strategically as to what the agenda's been. It's testament actually even to this meeting that there's been hours and hours of preparation just to get us all together to talk for 90 minutes here. And I think, the quality of the conversation shows that. And I think the quality of the collaboration is down to the organizational skills. And so I do think, particularly academics and in the clinical space as well, the universities need to recognize that not only funding cutting edge research that's going to get you a paper is important, but actually funding those supporting translational research offices, technology transfer offices, all of those people that spend a lot of time organizing teams, following up actions. So I think that's, and again, it goes back to leadership and soft skills there, making sure that those communities of deeply skilled scientists, clinicians, and policymakers, they've got time to think, which means you need to do, a lot of the operational grunt you need support for. And I would say it's just as important to connect those stakeholders. So that's the first point. The other point I was just going to pick up from what Julie said is really about, if there's an exchange or a studentship where you've got commercial insights, a partnership between a commercial and academic laboratory. I've only ever heard success stories. And I think how we measure collaborations is really important. It's one of the things I need to do for Hirani is how do I measure our success, because I'm not developing any drugs. We're not going to do any science, but we are actually going to increase productivity. So I think real thinking about how we can measure that and share that learning between universities or between collaboration organisers, I think that's a really important part, and we need more funding and recognise that that's just as important as the deep science.
Thank you, Joanne. Chaz, I'm going to come to you in a minute, and I want us to talk about metrics and how we measure this moving forward. But can I come back to Glenn? Glenn, you had a specific point about the requirement for specialised skills. Is there anything that there's kind of a red flag on the horizon that you think we might have a dearth or a gap in coming forwards?
Not that I'm aware of from my perspective at the moment, early days in this role. So I'd probably look to Julie to say what does she think she's missing in that drug discovery pipeline space, to be honest.
I was going there next, Glenn. I just wanted to check in because you raised it. Julie, are you missing anything?
I think what we're starting to invest more in, as Chaz has already discussed, is AI. We're now seeing a much bigger role across every step of the drug discovery process, from identification of targets. And one of the things that we've been doing quite recently, which is looking really exciting for the UK spine, is to be having academics and clinicians working with the Open Targets platform at EBI, and just being able to do a really thorough review of all the new drug targets that could be applicable in the pathways underlying aging. And it's got some really exciting stuff coming through from that. Because it's difficult to, what's the next target to look at next? You can't look at everything. You have to have a really educated selection that you can then start to work on. And I think AI is then going to place a role in screening, which compounds to screen against, the hit to lead stage, lead optimization stage, patient identification. It's going to play a step in every single step of the drug discovery process. It's going to have a role. So for me, that's the next big thing.
Thank you. And thank you, Glenn, for pointing me in Julie's direction. You were right. So Chaz, you and I have had great conversations in the past about open innovation, partnership, collaboration, and how you measure it. And it just seems to me that this whole question that we're trying to address now needs some metrics, some KPIs and some metrics. And you're good at that. So give us a starting point for what kind of metrics we should be putting in place to measure how good or bad we are going to be at addressing the skills agenda, addressing the partnership, collaboration, and evidencing it and communicating it to government and key stakeholders.
I mean, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that, but I mean, certainly the SGC, as many of you know, what we've always tried to do is to set some pretty ambitious goals. And if you have those ambitious goals, they're stretch goals, it forces people to develop new technologies, new ways of doing things, collaborating, realizing synergies, leveraging resources, etc. It forces us to do things, hopefully in a better way, faster way and cheaper way, etc. So I'm a great fan of it. But if I may, Martino, just going back to the skills point, I'm a great believer in the power of the individual. And, I'm Glenn and I have chatted about this. I'm amazed what one individual can do. So, if I think of people like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or Bezos or Elon Musk, I mean, these individuals, they have created new industries. They've created hundreds of thousands of jobs. They've created trillion-dollar companies, and they have changed the world. And I mean, unfortunately, you can get sort of an individual, they can damage the world as well, like that person we've got in the White House until January the 20th. But, it's amazing what one individual can do. Now, I think in this game that we're playing, I think we need great leaders. I think we need great innovators. I think we need great entrepreneurs. I should say, there's lots of researchers, but I'm not convinced not all of those researchers are innovators, and not all innovators are entrepreneurs. So I think we need more leaders, more innovators, and more entrepreneurs. I do think we need people who have the mental agility to sort of grasp things in different disciplines and sort of bring it all together and create a single vision. So, you know, we need a few more sort of polymaths, etc. I've already said I think we need people who can do AI, machine learning, big data, etc. I think we have a shortage of clinical pharmacologists. And my sense is we also have a shortage of real experts in sort of inflammation immunology as well.
Thank you, Chaz. So, Joanne, I'm going to come back to you because I know you've been passionate about partnerships and collaborations. I just want to ask you specifically, how do you measure? What sort of key KPIs, metrics do you put in place?
So I'm just developing that for the Health Innovation Research Alliance here, and it's hugely challenging to do. You can measure really simple things like number of events, number of participants at events, and those sorts of pieces. But I think it's really important to get some quality. So those are quantitative metrics, some qualitative metrics around, you know, follow somebody that's been on a part of a collaboration. It would be really interesting to follow their career path and see whether or not they've developed some of those skills that Chaz said is much needed. And understand the need for you know, developing more data analytical skills if you're a technical specialist in biology or pharmacology, or really, you know, understanding the importance of entrepreneurship and that sight through to the market and to be able to deliver some of those business insights. So I think that would be quite an interesting thing to do. It's just come to me now, actually, that it would be nice to see, do people that participate in collaborations do better, and actually do they go on to become entrepreneurs or innovators and then entrepreneurs. So I think that's really an interesting piece. There are other metrics, but they're very kind of consultancy type metrics about how clusters are connected, and I think that there will be more coming along. And in fact, Hirani's part of the UK Life Sciences Cluster Network, so there's MedCity, which I know is for the wider South East, Northern Health Sciences Alliance, Research Scotland, Welsh one, and G4 down in the southwest. And I think we'll come up with some metrics to measure that collaborative potential and the multidisciplinary aspect of those collaborations. So I think watch this space actually is very much about where I'm coming from there.
Okay, thank you guys. That was a really good catch-all of some of the things that, you know, have been spoken about in the sessions and that we've addressed as a specific question. I just wanted to add in, you know, from our pre-meet, Julie's talked about her passion, and my passion is about jobs tomorrow and how we enthuse the next generation and STEM. And it just feels to me that, you know, one of the positive outcomes of this crisis is that the radar and the focus and the potential benefit of careers in science has been right under the microscope, and how we develop and deliver that story better so that our elders believe that we are doing what we said we should be doing is really, really important. And, you know, we've created a Schools to Science Park movement around the UK to enthuse STEM students about careers in science, and long may that continue. And I hope you all just think about that in all your roles moving forwards, about what we do about jobs tomorrow. Because as Chaz says, you know, we're about creating industries from now on, and unicorns and billion-dollar companies that will really have an impact, and a positive, constructive impact on our community. We understand the need for future work and future industry development around pandemics, diagnostics and vaccines. But Chaz has already mentioned the antibiotics crisis that will hit us eventually, and what we need to do about that. So I've just got one last catch-all under this section question for you. There's something about leadership that I think Joanne's mentioned and Chaz has mentioned already. And I just want to give you a last chance to make some comments about, and particularly in the way that we've evolved through the current crisis. Have you noticed either personally or in your organizations, a change in leadership style for the better that needs to continue? I'm going to start with Julie there.
No. It's a simple answer to that one. I think
Well, do
it's.
you feel that's a positive or a negative?
I think whilst it's been great to see everybody being able to work from home and keep things moving and using outsourced partners across the globe to keep things moving, I think there's no real change from having people in the building and face-to-face contact. And you can give examples like one of the PIs in the DDU thought everything was going swimmingly at work and everybody was working away from home fine, and people were in the lab and shift patterns. And when we started going back in the building just to be seen, that's when people will open the door and tell you the niggly stuff, the stuff they wouldn't have set up a Teams meeting for. So for me, I think in terms of day-to-day operational leadership, it needs to be back in the buildings. I don't think that we should be moving to this suggested way of, we don't need offices anymore, we can all work from home. We do need offices, we do need engagement on a day-to-day level. I think what we have seen on a national level is leadership in terms of the consortia that have come together in the response to COVID, and I'd like to see more of that. But I think most people want to get back to face-to-face contact.
Thank you, Julie. I couldn't agree more. And the way you put it and the example that you gave was fantastic. And I do think we've got some benchmarks with the way that BIA behaved to get the consortiums around Lighthouse together, and the way that the Vaccines Task Force has behaved, despite the criticism, has been a real shining light. Joanne, any comments on leadership from you?
Yeah, I think that Julie, you explained that brilliantly, and I would completely agree. And I think the pandemic has highlighted that we can all work away on Zoom. You can get stuff done. It's becoming increasingly apparent is that the loss of creativity, of even sessions like this where you can ideate, but the time when you reflect on what you've heard and you turn to your neighbour, usually in a conference or over coffee, and begin to discuss it and begin to understand where those connections are. And I think at the moment we're coasting along on the connections that we had 9 months ago and the ones that we're managing to maintain on Zoom. But my fear is the loss for these early career researchers who are missing out on that. They're missing out on the connections, the sight through to leadership, because they're not leaders are working from home potentially, and they're in the laboratories, and they're missing out on developing their network, which will become increasingly important as they progress in their careers, to understand how they solve some of these big challenges. So absolutely, we need to work out a hybrid way of getting stuff done, but actually allowing time to be creative, and developing those ideas to solve the next challenges.
Joanna, I'm just not going to let you off there because, you know, I value your opinion on this. That do you feel like you personally have enough exemplars, gold standards, benchmarks on leadership that it's a yes/no that you look up to?
No, because they're not visible. No, I don't have leaders that are visible to me. You don't see it. And actually, I'm gonna pick up on that. One of the things I think is really important is to give early career researchers a sight through to boards or some of those decision-making meetings, even if they're observers, to just see what happens, how people behave, and understand what the key inputs are, because they're not just scientific inputs, they're economics and they're cultural and financial. So I think that's really important. Yeah. So sorry, you haven't shut me up.
As always, Joanne, you came back to me in the way that I expected you to. That was brilliant. Thank you. Glenn, comments on leadership from your perspective?
Yeah, I think we've seen some interesting institutional and individual leadership styles emerging under pressure. And yes, some of those are negative, some of those are positive. I think if I pick up on Chaz's point and Joanne's point, I'll try and spin a bit of positivity around the virtual world. So it has allowed us to bring together groups faster, and perhaps engage more in an agile fashion that perhaps we'd spend 6 months organising. We've been able to do in a week or 2 weeks to bring them together and talk about it. And it has allowed us to start thinking, how do we expose all parts of the career pathway in academia to different aspects of that world? Can we bring them into how policy is made, how decisions on funding are made? Can we promote placements? Because you can do them virtually, can they spend time discussing things with different parts of the sector? So actually there is a positive lesson to take away. And all right, I agree completely that we all need to get back to seeing each other and having that human interaction where things get more creative and productive. But there are some ways to use where we are now to bring different people to the table, expose people to different parts of the world they're in, and maybe promote that entrepreneur that wouldn't have actually been able to see somebody because it was too complex to arrange the trip. So I think there are some things that we can build on. And on the metric front, I completely agree. We need to decide what we value in the system. And if we value leadership, entrepreneurship, innovation, equally with underpinning research and intellectual excellence, we should say so. And we should recognize that and build in structures that promote that.
Thank you, Glenn. And Chaz, any comments on leadership?
Yeah, one word that I don't think we've mentioned today, Martino, is mentorship. And, I have to say, and I say this to many, many colleagues, I mean, I realize I'm working in a very privileged environment, and I have to say I've benefited over the past several decades from having some amazing mentors. I could list a whole load of them, and Graham Russell, who's on this call, is one of them. And, these people have given up so much of their time to help me navigate my career, to make suggestions, etc. And that, frankly, is so inspiring, and it's critical in a time like this. You need that support and that mentorship. And, and I'm lucky I'm surrounded by so many individuals like that. But the other thing I would say around leadership, Martino, is that sort of, a few months ago, I was a bit worried that I wasn't seeing anybody emerge as a global leader in this pandemic. And, WHO was being undermined. A lot of the countries seem to be working on their own, etc. But what's been really exciting in recent months is to see Jeremy Farrar, emerging as that person. He knows the area. He's so sensible. He's so measured. He's a brilliant communicator. I mean, and I think that's wonderful. And again, I think that's inspiring for all of us.
Thank you, Chaz. So thank you to all. I think we've got to the end of our specific questions, and maybe we'll come back with some final comments. I just want to pick up on the 2 or 3 questions that are outstanding. Nick Wilcox, I'm going to read this out. I'm not sure you're expecting us to even touch this question as a panel, and you'll understand why I won't address the panel, but I'm going to read it out because I do think it's important. I know it's very non-woke, but hasn't COVID highlighted that we should all be arguing in parallel for assisted dying in hopeless cases, without which the NHS and social care will soon be drastically overwhelmed? I ask as one aged 77. Nick, you'll understand why I won't ask the panel to touch that one. I think that's a whole offline conversation around that, but thank you for sharing, and I understand what you're saying. A general question from Didier. Are you in favour of considering the right to medical progress for longevity as a common good? See, among other things, Article 27 UDHR. I am going to ask just a yes/no from the panel if they have any comments around medical progress, longevity. Anything from you? No. Okay. Glenn?
No.
No. Joanne?
It's a yes and a no, I think.
Yeah. No, I'm not expecting anybody to address this one directly because it's kind of a challenging question, really. But I'm obliged, and I feel obliged to read these questions out because people have taken the time to fill them in. And I assume a no from you, Chaz, yeah? Thank you. So here's one I think we can answer, and it's back to the skills from Monica Spicer. What is the actionable way from the statement, we need people with who are X, so that's relating to the kind of skill, what should be done to meet those folks where they are to draw them into this space? So I think that's something around convergence. I think that's something about doing better at finding the people and the skills that Glenn and others have identified as a need. So where should we start? Julie, how do we do this better, finding the people who are X?
Oh, it's not easy, is it? I mean, certainly one of the things that we do in the academic base is put a lot of time and effort into trying to recruit new PIs. It's very difficult because the good people out there, they've got a reputation and everybody wants them. And it's a case of who's got the best package to show, for want of a better expression, that attracts the best talent. It's a difficult one, certainly not helped by Brexit at the moment.
No. Again, a very honest answer, Julie. Thank you. Joanne?
I think it's important to recognise that we may not know what X is. It's a new skill, to your point that you raised convergence there, Martino, that 10 years ago, we didn't think that we needed biologists that could understand data science or that there wasn't that pull there. And now there's whole new fields of computational medicine that's opened up. So I think a takeaway from this, and I think maybe Glenn can comment on it, what's been done to think about, developing new courses or new areas of research, new institutes that may well address some of this, I guess, grey space that occurs between the two fields. That was a woolly answer. I apologise, but
again, I'm going to come back to you and just ask you about the role that things like knowledge transfer networks. I know this is something that you've been exposed to in other ways, and surely there's a way, because KTNs act in cross-sector areas. Isn't there a way to somehow draw those skills in through those kind of networks?
There is, but somebody needs to, back to my point about supporting that, somebody needs to be taking those notes, if you see what I mean. So we'll all talk about it and we'll say, oh, we really need somebody that understands X, Y, Z, and then there's nobody actioned to do it. So maybe we need a specific part of bays or skills that are really, maybe the knowledge transfer networks can feed those bits up, because they're often throwaway comments that maybe aren't actioned.
Yeah, not just for you, Joanne, but for everyone. One of my experiences was at a manufacturing conference when we used to have physical manufacturing conferences, and the panel was all pharma life science people plus one automotive person at senior level, and all were at senior level. And the pharma person was talking about a specific problem they had around labeling and bottling and robotics. And the manufacturing guy just basically said, "Where have you been? We solved that problem 10 years ago." So I just feel that we're not learning enough cross-sector. We're not, by convergence, I talk about solving biological problems by bringing in IT, electronic, engineering, data skills to solve that problem. So there's probably something around what is the problem, and open calls and open challenges that, Chaz and I have been exposed to in current and different lifestyles that we could do more around. Glenn, any comments?
Yeah, I think there are two parallel tracks. There's trying to bring person with X in from within, which means we need to train people at all stages of career, whether that be DPhil, PhD level, early career researchers or fellows and beyond. If it's to Chaz's point, if we want to find these individuals that understand our space and become entrepreneurs or great leaders who open up new areas of research and science and innovation for us, we mustn't lose sight of it's possible to do that from within. But to your point about bringing people in from outside, actually convening that kind of community is something which research funders like councils and UKRI can do. And I would agree with you that there are aspects of whether it be healthcare and health service design through to research that have been solved in other sectors that we can learn from. The beauty of being the job I'm in, and genuinely mean that, is I get to work with lots of other councils and different science communities, so we can start to bring those together in these conversations, not on our own behalf, but we do that to try and inform how we work, but also on behalf of our communities, so that we do begin that cross-fertilisation, whether that's in centre units and institute settings, or whether that's through grant awards. We have many ways to try and make it happen.
Chaz, you're surrounded by cross-sector people, aren't you?
Yeah, I am, Martino, and I'm lucky. But let me try and not give a specific answer. I mean, sort of, you know, one of the things I've noticed, I'm sure many of my colleagues have noticed, is that more and more of our undergraduates want to learn entrepreneurial skills. So we're doing various things across the university to enable that. As you know, in Oxford now, we're probably creating 20, 25 companies a year. One of the challenges we're having in the ecosystem now is that we don't have enough scale-up entrepreneurs. So this is not, you know, it's fine creating a company and creating a few jobs, and the company hopefully grows to be worth £1 billion. But what the UK economy needs is companies that are going to grow, as you said, Martina, to 50 billion, 100 billion, the future GSK. And ultimately, wouldn't it be great if we had a $1 trillion company in the UK, like Apple or Amazon or Microsoft, et cetera, Why is it they're all in the US on the West Coast, et cetera? If we had one or two companies like that in the UK, I would be less worried about the future of this country's economy in the short, medium term.
Chaz, I couldn't agree more. I think, you know, the mistake the government makes is talking about creating industries around cell and gene, and now needing a manufacturing industry around vaccines and diagnostics. But we don't, we work from bottom up, and we assume that it takes a small amount of time to go from startup to big industry. And we don't look at the other end and how we can do more to create those big companies that we can build ecosystems, clusters, and industry around. Cool, that was good. There's a question coming around CROs, Julie.
I saw that, yeah.
I think this is one for you.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly different.
Julie, let's just read out the question, okay?
Sorry.
What would you say is the place of biotech CROs to help bridge the difference between working practices in academia versus clinical industry setting? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I think there's two different types of CRO interactions. There's one where the CRO becomes an extension of your team, and there's one where you simply outsource things like synthetic chemistry. I think the former model normally applies to the UK-based CROs. Often they have specific technical skills that are internalised inside the academic base or into small companies. And then I think often the low-cost CROs for doing things like synthetic chemistry tend to be out in Asia. And I think there's definitely a different interaction that you have with those companies. So for me, we're certainly using CROs more, both the UK ones and overseas. And there's definitely learning to be had in both directions.
And Julie, just to push back at you a little bit. So, you know, are you seeing any difference in the way that, you know, the traditional perception of a CRO is not what we'd all want it to be, but I sense that there's been a change in attitudes and approaches, and the importance of supply chain has never been more escalated and elevated at national government strategic level with PPE and diagnostics. So,
and I think what we've seen as well across the UK is the downsize of the pharma R&D base, and lots more specialist CROs have started to spring up as a direct result. So every time you see a big pharma moving out, you then see this cluster of CROs forming. So yeah, I think there's definitely a much stronger interaction with CROs, particularly UK-based CROs, than we've ever had before.
Glenn, you must see the same thing, right?
To be honest, from my perspective now, I think it's probably one to ask colleagues from Innovate rather than from MRC. It's not something I'm particularly involved in around CRO space, to be honest, at the moment.
Okay. Joanne?
Actually, I can comment on that in the sense that I'm an assessor for Innovate UK, and I see two different types of application. One where it's obvious that the startup or the company doesn't really understand what the CRO and subcontractor will do, and there's no description of what they'll do. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be, because there's a lot of assumptions there, and so a collaborative approach to CRO work is very important. The other end of the spectrum, I see an application of a CRO to a startup or an SME, where they add a huge amount of value, and they're adding hundreds of years of knowledge of their collective team's knowledge within the CRO to really move the needle forward on a startup, but for a price at which they can afford. And I think that there is definitely a place there. And to Julie's point, that in a lot of the pharma industry, as they moved out of R&D in the UK after the previous recession from 2009, many people sort of began to start up these CROs, and I think that there's a huge wealth of knowledge there, but we just need to make sure that we access it and use it appropriately.
Charles, if I may, I'm going to call a halt there. We're on a 3-minute warning, and I have to tell you, I can't tell you how excited I am about looking forward to your wrap up now. So we're on standby for Chaz's wrap up, but I want to give us a chance for ourselves to wrap up and almost loop back to almost an hour and a half ago from where we started. I think we should all leave a wrap up around skills to Julie, and I want her to give us the rah-rah version and the passionate, optimistic version. But I want us all to pick one thing, one take-home message for UK Spine, for the delegates, for what we've learned, what we want to share, okay? I'm going to start with you, Glenn, if you don't mind. What's your wrap-up take-home message for us all, please?
I think I go back to collaboration and multidisciplinary research to solve the complex problem. I think if we don't, we're learning how to collaborate across sectors much better than we have in years. And yes, it's taken a difficult situation to get us there. I think that collaboration, that accepting of the complexity of each of our communities' research, of the problems we're trying to address, and developing tools and ways of working to solve that problem. So I'm very optimistic that we can build on these closer collaborations as the pace at which we can design and deliver research, and that I think will allow us to unlock the deep complexity that is multimorbidity and aging.
Thank you so much for that optimism. Chaz, do you want to get involved in this, or do you want to leave it for your wrap up?
I'm happy to leave it with the colleagues.
Okay. Joanne, come on, give us the rah-rah version, please.
So I'm gonna maybe come in left field. I'm gonna go with empowerment, which is that I think what this UK Spine particular conference has proved, that enabling patient engagement and public engagement is really important. The most engaged people in health are the people who are currently suffering ill health, and so empowering them, whether it's through funding or community groups, or understanding what medicines they need, and also what priorities they have, how do they determine what healthy life is hugely important. And I think that we will see a change where the public and patients and communities are engaged in healthcare much more in the future.
Thank you. Julie, go crazy. Go on.
I think we have to invest in more of the translational skill set. And I think that has to start at the undergraduate level. I think we need to bridge the gap in between the excellent science that we've got inside the academic base and turning that into medicines and diagnostics that are fit for purpose for the patient base. And I'm not suggesting that all scientists need to know absolutely everything, but it's about having a more, I guess, holistic view to science. So you're not just focused on one piece. You have to think about where it's going to go next and who's going to do it.
Thank you, Julie. That's a great point to finish off. Panelists, I cannot thank you enough. That was just wonderful. I hope you enjoyed that banter and barrage as much as I did. I really thought we really covered a lot in that, and a lot of home key messages were hopefully laid out for the audience, and I hope the audience enjoyed it. And thank you so much to the audience and the delegates who posted so many questions that were right on the money, right on the spot. And if I haven't addressed, I think I addressed most of the questions. If I haven't, I do sincerely apologize. But I would normally ask for a virtual round of applause for the panelists, but please accept one from me. You were brilliant. I do want to give credit to Brian in particular from UK Spine, but Beverly and Victoria for whipping us into shape, for preparing the information that we needed to make this panel as good as I think it has been. So thank you, and thank you for the organisation of the overall conference. And I hope you've got out of it what you wanted, and I think there were some very, very key messages. So thank you, panelists.